All right, everybody. I do believe we are live. Welcome to yet another Break the Rules live stream. I'm your host, Lev Polyakov, with all these books behind me here. And we are here today once again with Dave, the Distributist, Vladislav Davidzon, as I like to say.
Vladislav Davidzon, yes.
Exactly, a senior fellow of the Atlantic Council and a contributor to Tablet Magazine, Foreign Policy Magazine. So a lot of interesting things. But today we're not going to be focusing that much on Ukraine. We are going to be focusing more on what you've experienced, Vlad, with your latest article, the quality of the American elites and what exactly has transpired when it comes to Ukraine now going into Kursk, going beyond whatever the Americans wanted, with the Americans not really, having a handle on that situation one way or another, and what that means in the long term, not just for Ukraine, but for the Western world in general. And
Right.
yeah, I think we should just start it off talking about your experience there, Vlad, with your article, and then bring it on over to Dave and go from there. And again, everybody, if you have not subscribed yet, smash that subscribe button right now and like and comment and all that good stuff. Patreon.com/break the rules. Vladislav, you get the floor, buddy.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for having me back on. So, uh, I wrote an article. I think it'll be of interest to anyone who is interested in foreign policy or America or Ukraine or Russia or NATO or the White House or American politics or Israel or anything really. If you're just interested in the world, it is an article that is. I have the receipts. I got the facts very right. I beat Gideon Rachman of the Financial Times and Amy McKinnon and Jack Ditch of Foreign Policy to the hilt. I was the first one to pick up on and report out the story of the Ukrainian elites ignoring. I'm going to use that word again. Ignoring Washington D.C. in doing what they want to do and what they need to do, what they feel they need to do in prosecuting this war against the Russians. And they did this having followed and very carefully observed the example of the Israelis killing their political enemies, one Hamas and one Hezbollah elite on July 31st and 30th and 31st of this past year, so exactly a month ago. What happened was that Mansour Netanyahu, think whatever you want of him, Prime Minister of Israel, returns from speaking in front of the U.S. Congress and then going to see whoever runs the White House at this point in America, whoever it is running the country, and that's not apparent who is running the country. I don't know. Whoever's running the White House and the National Security Council, and Miss Kamala Harris, I believe Mr. Tom Waltz was also in the room. They met him right after he addressed the U.S. Congress, and they give him a slight slapping on the wrist for his being a very, very, very bad boy indeed. And they told him to keep it in his pants and not continue to escalate the war as they see it between Israel and Iran and its evil. I use that word in the great metaphysical sense of evil proxies in the Middle East: the Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, various Shia paramilitary forces. Right, there are lots of Iranian proxies and equities, as the great Barack Obama referred to them in the Middle East. And Netanyahu listened very politely to these speeches, which were proffered to him in the White House, then flew back to Jerusalem and immediately ordered the assassination of Mr. Fakr and Mr. Hania. So he ordered the killing of a big guy in Tehran and ordered right afterwards the killing of a big guy in Beirut. So complete escalation dominance on the part of Israelis and complete disregard for a let's use the charitable phrase brain dead American White House, who's not which is apparently not being run by anybody or being run by committee or being run by whoever. Maybe it's Barack Obama. Maybe it's Lev Polyakov. Maybe it's Curtis Yarvin. I don't know who's running the White House. I don't know. Maybe I'm running the White House. I do know that I'm not running the White House because I would know. As far as I know, it's a committee of aides who have personnel staffed up the Obama and the Biden administrations, right? So the Israelis ignore the American injunctions not to kill these guys and not to create further escalation of the conflict 2 months, 2.5 months, 3 months before an American election, and they do what they need to do anyway. The Ukrainians watch this very carefully, having been preparing their own offensive into Russia without telling the Americans for 3 months, and they say, "Oh, this is very interesting. Ukrainians don't need to ask the Americans because the Israelis don't." So August 6th, immediately right after the assassinations in Beirut and in Tehran, the Ukrainians go all in on an audacious invasion of Russia with about 10, 20,000 guys, right? And they do not ask for permission. They kind of fuzzy along the edges, blur the distinction between the what the Americans allowed them to hit with American provided weapons and did not allow them to hit, and they just go all in on their own military plan. And as opposed to last summer when they told the Pentagon and the Americans what they were going to do, this summer they did not do so. So you have this case where you have a American president who is basically Parkinson's, dementia, zombie, whatever he is. He's out of the game, and you have American allies, proxy allies, who are in the midst of what they see and what are existential wars for survival, basically ignoring not just the advice but the demands of the Pentagon, the National Security Council, the White House, and doing what they need to do or feel they need to do in the middle of a war. So this is a really radical moment.
Maybe I can cut in here with a question.
Please.
Do, don't you believe that, that there are elements inside the American government that want escalation? And that seems to be an easy, I know that they have to publicly say that they're against that, but it seems to me that elements of the American government want to have a big war with Russia so that they can be humiliated and removed from the global scale as a rival power. I should preface this. I am not a Ukraine expert, which is why
Yeah.
I'm very hesitant to discuss
Okay. Fine. Yeah.
Ukraine.
No. 100%.
But
Like, yeah. Let's. You're an intelligent guy who's asking intelligent questions. We can and I'll answer to the mid level of technical specification as one does to an intelligent non-expert, right? Um, Basically, before we go into the greater implications for American empire management or alliance management, or what it means that Americans cannot manage their allies, or the Americans press a button and nothing happens, or uh, uh, you know press a lever and then something happens that they didn't want to happen, right? Which means that they're out of control, right? Before we get into that, let me just answer that question. This administration, the Biden administration, did not want this war, and they tried very hard, though in futile fashion, to keep it from happening. It had happened. They did not prepare adequately for what they needed to do. They thought the Ukrainians would fold, would collapse, so they did not adequately prepare them in the autumn of 21 to fight. Once it became obvious that the Ukrainians were fighting, despite all odds, and winning and taking territory, they slowly started to give the Ukrainians weapons, but they didn't give them all that they wanted, and they kept kind of rationing equipment and arms in a slow fashion in order to make sure that they wouldn't lose, but they wouldn't win either. They're utterly terrified of escalation with the Russians. They don't want nuclear war. They don't want regional wars. They don't want Russia for them, worst case scenario, to 15 different countries. So this National Security Council, run by Mr. Jake Sullivan and a few other people, do not want the Russians humiliated too much. They want a managed situation. They want the Ukrainians to win, but they don't want the Russians to lose. They don't want the Russians to be too deeply humiliated. They don't want regime
you
change in
don't.
Russia.
Look. I kind of was very consciously trying to avoid a discussion on Ukraine, which
Sure.
maybe I'm the wrong person to be in this live
Well,
stream
no,
right
as
now.
I said in the very
But
beginning, I wanted to
you
focus
don't
less on that and more
you
on the
don't
elite.
believe that. I have heard a lot of people who are associated with government. I don't have personal access to these people,
Mm-hmm.
but I've talked to a lot of people, at least in California politics, and in that general milieu of people who are in this government, there is a very identifiable opinion that this Ukraine war needs to be the first step to regime change in Russia.
Sure.
I don't know. Look, I'm not an expert, but I have a hard time believing that there aren't a lot of people with that same opinion in the State Department and who are making decisions that are geared towards regime change in Russia.
Okay, so first of all,
AKA a color
I want
revolution.
regime change in Russia. Let's start with that. I absolutely want a regime change in Russia.
I
Russia
want a
is a,
regime change in America. So
all right, fine. Okay, cool. Me too. Well, I mean, like, I'd like something similar, but let's get back to that in a sense, in a situation, in a second. There are lots of people who think, like, the Putin regime needs to go. It's not unlike the Hitler regime. It's not a clean comparison. I mean, the Hitler was much worse, and we can't compare what he did to what the Russians are doing, and yet they are trying to genocide a democratic nation and trying to get rid of a culture and kidnapping kids by the tens of thousands. It's terrible. It's a completely horrific war, and they're doing horrific things. And I think if the average American knew what they were doing, they would be like, okay, this is like almost as bad as what was happening in the 40s, and Americans have to step up when that kind of thing happens, right? So the last 20 years of failure of American liberal internationalism aside, this is really truly bad, right? This is a really bad case. And this is a core American interest right in the middle of Europe, next door to 3 or 4 European Union countries. You have a terrible war which is threatening all our interests, threatening our NATO allies, blowing up the grain supply, blowing up the chains of deliverables to lots of places.
well, to
It's a,
energy, certainly. We know that wasn't there the admission just last week that Ukraine was indeed the person that blew up that pipeline and that
um,
Germany owns. Didn't
yeah,
they
that's
come
very
clear of that
complicated.
yesterday?
Look, the Wall
Well,
Street Journal reported that. The Wall Street Journal reported that. I don't believe that Mr. Bojansky, who reported that piece, got it right. I still talk to experts who don't believe that is the case. There's still a lot of variables in play of what happened. I don't believe we still know what happened. I don't think the Ukrainians actually did themselves. And
sure. I mean, it's fog of war, right? We don't
fog of
really
war.
know anything
Yeah,
really. And I
right.
guess well, for the same reason that you don't believe that the Ukrainians are necessarily the party that blew up that German pipeline,
Right.
I guess I am incredibly skeptical when I hear stories of sort of one-sided atrocities in a war. My assumption in any war is that both sides are committing atrocities, because both sides certainly committed atrocities in World War II.
Okay.
And whenever I hear like one side's committing the atrocities, I get the sense that I might be hearing propaganda. I mean, okay, I mean, if regime change in Russia is your goal, like, I guess, then, why wouldn't you want to escalate against Russia, I guess, right? That seems, I mean, Russia believes that this war is an existential crisis for its regime, and that's why it's
Well,
fighting it.
it is now that they started it and they bet the entire regime's survival on it. I mean, that's their fault. We told them not to do it. I mean, the Kremlin rightly believes if they lose this war, they're not going to be able to stay in power. That's true, but That's why you don't put all your chips on the table at the end of the night in a poker match with a bad hand, right?
Yeah, but I mean, look, I mean, how much is our guarantee? I mean, look, again, I'm not an expert in Ukraine,
I
but
know.
like, we told Gaddafi that if he played ball with us, we wouldn't go after his regime, and then he did, and we just got rid of his regime anyway. The guarantee of the State Department, which is really what we're talking about here, that if we play by American rules, your regime is going to be safe. If I were in Vladimir Putin's shoes, I wouldn't believe that. And I have
Well,
absolutely no stake
uh
in who rules Russia. Again,
I know you don't.
my
I know you
concern
don't. I
is
know you
about the
don't.
American regime. But I'm just putting myself as the example that Lev used in the being John Malkovich machine into
Right.
Vladimir Putin, I don't know how much a guarantee, like, I don't know how, if NATO expands into Eastern Europe, and I don't know how much a guarantee that they won't go after my regime is worth from the administration, from the American government, given its track record.
Okay, so yeah, okay. So first of all, uh, it's the Russians who are difficult to pin down on their guarantees and their promises because they have nuclear weapons ultimately. The fact that they are nuclear power
Mm-hmm.
ultimately makes all these things much more complicated and much more safe for the Russians. Ultimately, we are in a detente with a nuclear power that has full spectrum strike capacity with I think it's down to 8,000 nuclear warheads, but that's still like a lot. They could still blow up the world
Mm-hmm.
50 billion times over, 150 times over, whatever it is, right? That's let's start with that. It is very difficult to regime change externally. No one's going to invade a nuclear power like NATO. NATO's not going to invade a nuclear power, and we kept hoping. By we, I mean the National Security Council and the State Department. And by the way, there is a schism between elements of the State Department and the National Security Council.
But
You're
Vladimir
not wrong.
Putin,
Yeah.
like John Malkovich and Vladimir Putin believes that such a regime change was accomplished by the West in like 1989.
I mean, 1991. Yeah. I mean,
No, sorry, it was 1991. I apologize. It's the wrong year, right?
yeah,
And
yeah, sure.
he believes that, not without some justification, that Boris Yeltsin and these people were essentially heavily supported by the State Department and that they accomplished a regime
Mm.
change
What?
because of the fact, and this was
Mhm.
the reason why this regime change was allowed is that essentially the security apparatus that they had up around Eastern Europe started to crumble, and this kind of created a domino effect where the security apparatus of the regime in Russia could no longer hold on to power.
Okay, well, first of all, there's like a lot. I hate to use this word unpack, and everyone attacks me when I use unpack as the professor had in me. But like, let's unpack this, right? First of all, are you like against the collapse of the Soviet Union as an American conservative? Come on,
No, no, but I said, remember the John Malkovich. Well, I'm not
right?
American.
You're in his head.
I'm
Yeah,
a
fine. Okay, yeah,
reactionary. I'm not a conservative.
I see.
I'm right. I'm a right winger, but I'm not. It's not better what I see as bad thing. It's
I get
what
it. Okay,
Putin sees as regime change, and Putin definitely sees a possibility for a cascading collapse of the Russian security apparatus
100%.
outside
This
of
is
Russia
true.
as
This
being
is
the
true. Yes.
first step to a regime change inside of Russia. And I guarantee you that, well, I don't guarantee you, I don't know this, but based on my interactions with government officials at the lower level, I have a high probability of believing that there are similar beliefs inside the United States State Department.
Okay, so I will rephrase that in a more like Western friendly way.
Mm.
In political science, there's this concept called democracy contagion.
Mm-hmm.
So strong men, certainly
It's
Putin.
a domino theory, but for democracy.
Yeah, yeah, domino. I mean, yeah, democracy contagion. Correct. Yeah, I mean, yes, that's right. So, like the strong men, certainly Putin saw what happened internally to his proxy, Yanukovych in 2014. But he watched as the mob of pitchforks of liberal democratic activists ran into Yanukovych's private house and started hanging out in his bedroom and looking at his porn collection, playing with his pet ostrich, and having dinner
Mm.
in like
Or
the dining room. So he
or what happened in
watched.
Romania and Ceausescu, right? That was even more like, I'm sure that scared people even more, right?
Yeah, but that's ancient history. I mean, like Putin uh, saw what happened
But is
to
it ancient history for Putin though? I don't think it is.
it's 35 years ago, man. Like, even more than that. It's like 37 or 38 years
Yeah,
ago. I
it's
mean,
it's it's like when The Little Mermaid came out. I remember saying that in theaters, right? I mean, like, we're ancient, right?
we are ancient. Yeah, but
I mean,
the counter argument to that is, man, like, should we just never push against dictators because dictators remember what happened to other dictators and they're all scared? Is that what we should do? or not do?
I do not think it's the United States' responsibility to unseat dictators. Yeah, you might have me on an ideological disagreement here, and I also don't believe in democracy contagion
I
or
see.
communism. When Robert McNamara talked about the domino theory across Southeast Asia, he was not completely incorrect, but
Yeah, he had a point.
it was not like, but the domino theory wasn't like, it was just like, oh, it's a force of nature that once one country becomes communist, the country next to it becomes communist. No, what was happening was that Mao's China had like agents and they were
Sure.
literally spending money to get these. And the same thing is democracy contagion is not like some organic force of nature. It's literally the machinations of the United States and its allies
Well, no,
trying
no,
to
no, no,
push
no,
their
no. I
style of
no.
government to Eastern Europe.
This I disagree with. Like I mean, the Russian regime, the Kremlin watched what was happening next door in Ukraine, and that happened internally because of Ukrainian internal democratic processes and liberal processes. And like, oh hell, and like Russians and Ukrainians are close, and like there are a lot of people who have a third of Russian population has family in Ukraine, and lots of Ukrainians have family in Russia, and there's a lot of intermarriage, and we're part of the same civilization, we speak the same language, and so when you see next door what's happening, it's not like Ceausescu or an Arab dictator in Libya getting like clipped in the backside right before he gets killed, right? It's next door, and it's something that did bring fear, I'm sure, into Putin's heart, because he thinks if Russians see that their next door neighbors and their friends, their cousins, whatever, not their bratski narod, not their brotherly nation, that's propaganda. We don't believe in that. We don't go with that. But if their cousins, their friends, if the Ukrainians across the border can live like normal people after the Soviet Union and have liberal democracy and an IKEA and Game Boys and Nintendo 64 and full supermarkets and retirement accounts and no corruption and no police state, why can't the Russian population start thinking, oh, why don't we start living like animals? So that
Yeah,
is
I
like,
guess I
yeah,
don't think that that's how people see it. I mean, I don't know. I mean, in 1991 or 89, there
right,
was a very, very stark standard of living difference between Russia and the people immediately to its west in Western Europe, in the
correct.
sense that they didn't have Game Boys or,
They,
Dreamcasts or
they didn't
whatever
even
they
have
had back
they
then.
didn't have toasters or cars, let alone
Yeah,
nice
I mean,
stuff.
Russia still
but
doesn't have like running water in certain places of it. So there is
yeah,
like
but
yeah.
the primary area of Russia that we're talking about, like in Moscow, I mean, I
No, but
don't know how
that's
the
a bad
stark difference
comparison.
between.
That's a really bad comparison because what Russia does, as far as its government collecting taxes, it takes all the taxes and it distributes them primarily to St. Petersburg, to Moscow, to Grozny, where it pays its tribute to the barbarian horde. So that's how it's able to keep the elites happy, while at the same time,
It
yeah.
sounds like how Canada is run. All the
Oh
taxes go
boy.
right out of the West and go
No,
right into
but
Quebec.
here's what I think we're really getting to, because you're talking about these justifications for why Putin might feel threatened and all that. Okay,
Right,
so a
right,
guy who's like hopped up on meth might feel threatened, and you could say, well, it's not
yeah,
justified. He's still threatened nonetheless. True, but then the question is, going back to what you said about China. From my perspective, Russia is pretty much owned by China at this point, and wherever Russia goes, it's fertile environments, as far as minerals, as far as other things that China's population needs to keep growing. So I do see in the future here there being a lot of motivation for China to want Russia to be its attack dog, going into Europe, consuming more of it. So when we're talking about, well, we don't want any part in this, just like the founding fathers intended us to stay out of Europe's business, that's all well and good in a world where Russia and China does not exist, but I'm always thinking like several steps ahead here. Okay, give it like a decade or two, what exactly is going to be our position in the world stage as far as not just the quality of life of Americans, but how much they'd be influenced by this much larger, much stronger Chinese power that now has all this influence and these resources to really screw us over. To me, that's the most important part of this whole thing. If
I
we're
mean, I think
willing to
we're
say,
coming to
like,
terms with the fact that it's going to be a multipolar world, right? I think that's just going to be our reality. And I know a lot of people don't want that, but I don't see how that's avoidable.
but it does kind of
I
go back to the
I
question
disagree,
of,
man. I disagree. I mean,
hmm,
I was born in Central Asia. I was born in Central Asia and was like a Russian citizen. I was a citizen of the Soviet Union and of Russia, and I've lived everywhere. I mean, the world is going to be run by Americans, Chinese, Russians, or some combination of authoritarian revisionist states, and the least worst possible world for for everybody, with all the problems, the well-known problems of America and American imperialism and American hegemony, blah 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 aside, is a world run for the general good by do-gooder Americans. It's like the least possible bad world of
Yeah,
all possible futures.
I think I would have agreed with you 20 years ago, but Iraq really, I mean,
Yeah,
Iraq and Afghanistan
yeah,
definitely
yeah.
did not work this way. So, I mean,
Sure.
the thing is this, first of all, I don't like how Japan and Germany are run by American do-gooders. I don't like, I mean, I guess it's a high standard of living in both countries, but a lot of the decisions there, I think, were bad. And we're around essentially re-educating the population. And I am, and when it comes to examples like our machinations in the Middle East with Iraq and Afghanistan, uh, or some of the things being done in South America, I don't this great track record of America managing other countries that are
100%.
not like it. It's not good
Can
enough.
I pop in to agree with you? First of all, although I am like a paid up member of the Blob in some ways, I'm also our friend Curtis Yarvin refers to me as a member of the opposition, which I am. But I have to tell you, I and other there are people who are very much older, much more responsible, much more influential than I am, whose politics is closer to yours than it is to the lefty progressive, like identitarian essentialist wokists that we probably don't like, would agree with you. Like I as an 18-year-old was protesting the Iraq War, and now 20 years later, we're still living with the fallout of America mismanaging two wars, financializing its economy, and deindustrializing itself, lying to itself, creating like a massive income inequalities, creating its own massive problems, having completely squandered the peace dividend of having won the Cold War. So, like you and I agree on that. And there are all sorts of responsible conservatives, 75-year-old men who ran things and were ambassadors of the United States to important places, who say, yeah, look, no one ever got punished for that miscalculation or those adventures or those hegemonic mistakes that created the terrain for a Trump and a Vance to arrive on the political scene. You and I agree with that 100%. I know it's very difficult for me with my politics and commitments to convince an intelligent guy like you, because it is the fact that the system screwed up very badly for 20 years. It's 100%. You're totally correct.
But doesn't the example of Iraq and Afghanistan indicate that we need to have different regions of the world run by sort of radically different systems? And
Yeah. Well, so here's the thing. Here's the thing. Like in Afghanistan, you needed after September 11th, you needed some kind of police action. Needed to be blown up. They needed to go
mm,
after Osama bin Laden. No country in the world could not blow something up after that. But you didn't have to go in and occupy Afghanistan and try to send in 250,000 do-gooders to reprogram basically a not even medieval but like a Stone Age society to be Pakistan or something. Like that was completely ridiculously insane. It was never going to work, and we shouldn't have been that insane or retarded to think that it could have worked, right? So like bringing Afghanistan into the shiny future and making Pashtun tribesmen who don't know how to count and often don't even know the difference between colors, right? Let alone be illiterate. Bringing them into like the utopian American thing, that was a millenarian, apocalyptic American Fantasian delusion.
but
Uh,
it sounds like this is a consistent. So America across the 20th century had this idea that they were going to turn everywhere into America. And
sure,
my
yeah.
two objections are, first of all, I don't want
Please,
everywhere turned into America.
you
And
good.
second of all, it just doesn't work. I mean, it doesn't work. And a lot of these countries, like Japan and Germany, that I think, again, their standard of living has increased a lot. There have been serious problems, especially with how they manage their society, that's come from the Americanization of their culture, in my opinion.
I got to step in here for a second.
Yeah, step in,
I
man. Like,
yeah,
gotta
so
defend denazifying Germany. Someone has to.
what I want to talk about here though is
Yeah.
the agreement that I have with Dave as far as a lot of these bad things going on in South Korea, worst Korea, and all these places. But what I think needs to be paid attention to here as well is what exactly is the modus operandi of places like Russia and China, where I don't want to imagine, what Dave imagines in his head, but if I could get, a read for some of the people on the reactionary side when it comes to how they see Russia, not really knowing that much about Russia, is that, well, this is like a reasonable country, we could strike some kind of a deal. I don't think
Yeah.
they're seeing it in the way that a lot of people who have been far more exposed to Russia see it, where
Yeah.
they're never, just like the leftists in college campuses, they're always going to keep going until they're stopped. And this actually ties into the incompetence that I wanted to talk about here when it comes
Yeah,
to today's
Hitler. Yeah,
elites.
Lev, like Hitler's like you had to step in and stop Hitler. Like Hitler's
Well, some of the
pure evil.
reactionaries
Right.
disagree with that. But if we were
Really?
to, yeah, again, because,
Well,
Well,
no, because the whole,
but put it this way, I
yeah,
mean, like, so World War II was a war
right.
between Hitler and Stalin. If you feel that I do not see how one
not
of
see.
those two sides is so morally, I do not see how it was such an easy call. Which I mean, like, why in the war between Hitler and Stalin is there one side that is definitively the one that needs to be stopped? Both of them essentially had designs over Eastern Europe, obviously. Both of them had, as a matter of fact, Stalin had more of a will to try to invade the West than Hitler did. So,
No,
and
that's not. I mean, that's not true. They divided Poland between themselves in 1939.
well,
At some
Eastern
point.
Europe, that's
Yeah.
Eastern
Well,
Europe.
labor
Right.
Strom. And again, the big problem here is that we always talk about, well, they said that they were going to stop here. They promised this. They promised that. Russia also promised Ukraine that as long as Ukraine gave up its nukes with the 1994 Budapest Accords, it's never going to invade. So this idea of like promises being kept, to me, that's BS. But I want to focus a lot more on the idea that I see with these, foreign nations like Russia and China. I really do
I want to
equate them.
stop you there,
Well,
Lev.
hold on
Before
one
we
second.
go on, yeah.
1 second though. I want to equate them a lot more with what you're seeing coming out of the far left, where whenever people concede any kind of room within our institutions to these people, they keep going, and they're always going to be after a target that's further away, some much more horrible goal than whatever it is they've got so far. And I really think that a lot of reactionary people, when they take a look at Russia or even China, they imagine, well, these people, as long as they get this, they're not going to want a bigger slice of the pie. And I think it does tie into these problems with the elites we have today, because these elites are not going to put a stop to it, in my opinion. Like, they are going to let these countries keep going and going.
Weren't we just admitting 15 minutes ago that America's ambition was essentially to remake all countries to be like America? And that might not be a bad thing. I mean, that's the definition of not being able to stop. I mean, if you're talking about a lot of our problems currently in Eastern Europe, it's NATO's inability to stop expanding, which I don't even know why NATO exists at this stage, right? NATO was designed to stop
radically
communist
disagree
attrition.
with. Radically disagree with, man. That I radically disagree with. So
What, that America expands its sphere of influence?
No, that a lot of our problems in Eastern Europe are because NATO could not stop expanding.
But
Here's the
it
thing.
did. Do you agree that it did expand into Eastern Europe?
Well, I mean, obviously 2007
Okay, but
yeah.
yeah, but the thing is that shows you the same kind of behavior that Lev was talking about. The idea of mission creep, that once you have secured Western Europe, you now go to Eastern Europe, right? NATO was supposed to secure Western Europe. That was its mission during the Cold War. Then
Right.
suddenly, when the Cold War ended, instead of disbanding NATO, all we do is we expand the purview to cover Eastern Europe, indicating the exact same behavior that Lev was talking about, where like as soon as they get this country, they want the next country. No, look, I don't disagree with you about Hitler in the sense
Right.
that as his victories accumulated, his appetite would have increased.
Right.
Initially, at least, judging from what I know about the Third Reich, and I feel like I know a fair amount about it, the Third Reich's ambitions were almost entirely in Eastern Europe. Now, once Hitler got that, again, naturally your appetite would
Right.
increase, right? But that increase in appetite is not something that's exclusive to Russia or exclusive to Hitler or exclusive to Stalin. This sort of increased appetite with increased power happens to all major world powers. And it certainly is visible in the American empire, in my opinion.
I have a question for Vlad related to this. Vlad,
Please.
why is it
I
that...
wanted to push back
yeah,
to that, but go
well,
ahead.
that's exactly what we're going to be talking about. Like, what
Right.
was the motivation after the Soviet Union fell for some of these countries to join NATO? I know that for some of them later on, when they saw like the kind of government that Russia was starting to have, the motivation was obvious. We don't want to get invaded by these fucking
Sure.
people. But as far as early on, if we again go back in time, what were the initial motivations for some of these other ones if they didn't face as much of a security threat, at least from what I'm seeing?
Look, this is what Dave doesn't understand because he's not an Eastern European, and I understand that he's not an Eastern European, like unlike you and me. He's a nice American, and he just
My
like does.
father was born there.
Where was he born?
He was born in modern day Serbia.
Okay, got it. All right, fine, got enough, good enough. So you have a sense of the regional dynamics in that case, and of what happens after the collapse and dissolution of a Soviet empire or a communist empire. What happened was that Eastern European countries that had always been under the thumb of the Russians and or the German Empire, mostly the Russians, realized that this was an interregnum and a temporary period of Russian weakness, what was not going to hold. The Russians had been an imperialist power for 300, 400 years. The Russians had been expanding on the Mongol horde frame for a very long time, and all these little countries, the Balts, the Estonians, the Poles, the Lithuanians, the certainly the Latvians, which is basically half Russian anyway, because of imperialism and population transfers, realized that they were never going to be free of Moscow's yoke until they had serious security guarantees. They saw what happened to other countries that had no security guarantees, and they all were invaded sooner or later by the Russians. There are basically 5 zones in the world that are left out of security guarantees after the end of communism, which is Armenia and Azerbaijan quickly went to war against each other. Georgia, tension with Russia and then invaded by Russia. Moldova, invaded by Russia as early as 1992, 93, a year after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Ukraine, also invaded by the Russians, and as you well know, the Yugoslav zone, which quickly fell into fratricidal killing of each other, right?
Mhm.
So all five
Which
zones.
we invaded, or we didn't invade it, we bombed it
Yeah,
to
but
get
I mean,
the
we didn't
regime
start
change.
the war, man. We didn't start the war. They started killing each other, right? We
Okay.
came in later.
So you could, Dave, so you could
You
see
you
the
don't you
motivation.
don't think that war was essentially to get rid of Slobodan Milosevic, which we saw as somebody who was opposed to the Western idea expanding into Eastern Europe. You don't see that that's sort of a symmetrical thing.
Whether that is true or not, the bombing by the Clinton administration would have never happened if the Yugoslavs hadn't already been killing each other. They didn't. We didn't start killing people. They started killing each
So
other. You know
Dave,
that full well. Come on, Dave.
So, Dave, if you go into being John Malkovich mode for a second,
Right.
into the minds of some of these
But just
leaders of these
let
Baltic...
me just finish that
Sure,
one thought.
sure.
Let me just finish that one thought.
Sure.
Basically, every country left out of a security alliance sooner or later got like 100% chance of in the next 25 years of a major war, usually invasion by Russia or civil war. You know, if you were not integrated into a European or post-European or security alliance, you had a 100% chance of a major war in the next 20 years. It's just as simple as that.
So
Well, of course, because
yeah.
the reality on the ground is that each country in Eastern Europe is either going to be in the United States' alliance or it's going to be in Russia's alliance. And to the extent that there is a
Sure.
question over that, there's going to be a war. I do not see this as a one-sided thing. Like, oh well, all of these countries going under there seems to be this assumption in your worldview that the United States security umbrella is sort of a default natural thing, and the Soviet
After World War II, yeah, sure. After World War II, this is the best possible outcome. Yeah.
but it's. I mean, but again, that's this bias that like the United States security umbrella is natural, and having your government dominated by the United States is a natural extension of the way things are. and having your security being under the Soviet Union security umbrella or the Russian security umbrella or whatever the name changed, either one of those, and having our government subsequently dominated by them is unnatural and the product of direct aggression.
I got to get in here because we're not talking about the Austro-Hungarian Empire versus the United States. What we're specifically talking about here is it's like a Asiatic despotism that's not going to stop until you get rid of the powers that were influenced by the KGB, who are now the FSB. Those people, the mentality that they have is very, very different from, I think, any kind of political scenario that a lot of people on the reactionary end like to imagine. So sure, Dave, I completely agree with you.
No system of global power is going to stop. America is not going to stop if it wins in Ukraine. It's going to try to overthrow Russian regime, as far as I can figure out.
I mean, but we didn't want to do that. Like, we've had 2.5 years to try that, and
I know there's lots of people who I have talked to people who do want to do that.
Yeah,
and so like we don't want to do that. We didn't want to do that. Like, and I'm sure there's lots of people in Russia. I know there's lots of people in Russia who didn't want this war with Ukraine. The thing is that there's a natural incentive of all power systems to expand into power vacuums. That, I'm not an expert on Ukraine, but I am read enough by history to know that this is the case, and this is true for America and it's true for Russia. Now, first of all, I do not believe that America should just expand its security umbrella until it rules the world. I don't think it can, and I don't think that doing so is going to result in good governments in these new countries. I think that there is a case that America was competent enough to do that in 1955. At this point, we just replace these governments with dysfunctional idiots like we did in Afghanistan and Iraq that are totally unsuited for the culture. And that even if we can reform the culture, we turn it to this sort of self-terminating woke shit that now occupies America's government. But that's the reality. My concern is, how do we create a line that no one crosses in between the Russian sphere of influence or the Chinese sphere of influence and the American one? Because I don't think that, like, the story isn't about Russia expanding. The story is about two people expanding and then running into each other. And when they run into each other, it's in my interest to have that conflict result in a minimal amount of casualties, which certainly has not been the case in Ukraine, as far as I can tell.
Look, obviously, I believe that liberal democracy is far superior than to totalitarianism, and I also believe that America is not going to "quote unquote" target liberal democracies to make them dominated by America. Like, the Greeks have their own interests, and they can do what they want as long as a liberal democracy. They can compete in the world. Same with India. We're not, the Indians are they have problems, but they're a liberal democracy, part of the world order. And liberal democracies are not evil, to use metaphysical language that you would go into. They're not going to go running around and starting evil wars for the sake of conquest and domination, unlike jingoistic radical nationalists or communists.
Well, I could put it in a different way. I could put it in a different perspective. So, Dave, imagine all of a sudden you had an alien invasion. The aliens came down to Earth. They took all the people who live in Liberia. They multiplied them. And they put them in charge of Russia, as well as comprising all the people in Russia. So now imagine you're talking about not these Russians whose history, of poetry and all this good stuff, you recall. Now you're talking about people like General Butt Naked, like Barbecue.
Replacing populations with third world populations is much more the modus operandi of the American empire.
Sure. No, but again, I'm talking specifically about a scenario where I don't think you'd be able to give the same kind of respect to people who have been living in like a sub-third world condition and how they would play themselves out on the world stage when it comes to them expanding more westwards. I don't think you would be able to say, well, we're going to respect, this multipolar world, where these people from, like Haiti or whatever are now expanding over and over.
Do you think that America, like, however big Liberia is, whether it is
or Haiti,
the size of Russia or Haiti, the size, whether Haiti is the size of Haiti or the size of Russia, regardless of how much military power they have, the question is, can the United States, by which I mean really the United States State Department, can it design a government to rule over Haiti or Liberia? Is it good at doing that? Oh, and is liberal democracy necessarily the thing that needs to govern Haiti or Liberia? In my opinion, Haiti or Liberia need to be governed by more traditional modes of human governments in order for them not to just go spiraling off into chaos.
Real quick,
Okay.
before Vlad responds to that as well,
Sure.
if we look at the history of Russia, we could say that there were a lot of inequalities, present all the way back from, Mongolia conquering Russia and having like this permanent serf class. But if we also look at the people who were in charge of Russia, they were like cousins to the royal family of England. This
Sure.
was already like a whole different scenario, even that
Yeah, it's
was in the
Europe.
USSR
We're
now.
not talking about like reprogramming Pashtun villagers to behave like New Yorkers, which is you and I would agree impossible. We're talking about intervening in Europe, which is our civilization, which is our culture, which is our allies, which are our alliances. And like Haiti has problems, and if a country like Afghanistan wants to live as it did, and perhaps we shouldn't do things like that, right? And there are all sorts of national and traditional societies that we should not intervene in, but as long as they
I mean,
don't create massive problems like blowing up buildings in the middle of New York City or the Pentagon, right?
I mean,
Obviously,
this is the problem here, Vlad. Is like a major project of the American empire has been to de-Europeanize Europe over the last 50 years.
has it? I mean, like,
Yes, it
I don't like
has. It has.
McDonald's either, man. But like, I don't like McDonald's either. I don't like.
First of all, the Americans absolutely saw Americanization of European culture as part of the security mission. If you go into the embassies of like that they had in Afghanistan and Iraq, you can see like George Floyd murals and all this
No,
stuff.
they got rid of
This has
that.
been-
The Taliban painted over that mural.
Yeah, sure, but this is
Yeah.
you can talk to people who worked in Afghanistan and Iraq, and they'll tell you the same thing. Like enormous gobs of money were spent explicitly trying to export American culture to these
Well,
countries,
yeah.
and the same thing was underway in
Or
Europe as well.
modernity. No, no. I mean, like,
Yeah, but it's
no,
part of its
modernity. I mean, it's
part of
not,
its modernity,
yeah,
but part of it's also an explicit project of the American government. The second thing too
right,
is that the American supported governments in Europe
right.
currently are demographically de-Europeanizing Europe.
Most of them, yeah.
In very short order, Europe will large swaths of Europe will no longer be part of a European civilization in the way that you just meant it. So
Sure.
I mean, to do this whole thing where it's just like, well, they're Europeans, therefore they're just like Americans. I'm not so sure Europeans should just be like Americans.
I'm a European American. I agree with you, man. I do. But like we basically have the same civilizational structures. There's some weird things that Europeans do, or some regional quirks, and the Americans have their own thing. But basically, it's the same civilization.
Yeah,
Like,
but the elites are
Canadians
not
live
acting.
like,
But the elites are not preserving that, I think, is Dave's
Yeah.
point.
100%.
They're not
That's
preserving that.
100% true, man. That's
Yeah.
100% true. But like,
And I would also
you-
say that as far as Russia goes, one thing that could be looked at as a potential goal when we're talking about
Yeah.
what Russia should look like, it would be kind of going back to this nobility that existed within that class, but a little bit more updated so that at least the people that are under that nobility are not just like farm animal tier serfs, but are
Right.
people who are much more like the rest of Eastern Europe. That I think would be a good goal, and it's a very different goal than talking about this woke nonsense, the George Floyd murals and all of that. Right, Dave? Like, you wouldn't be opposed to that kind of a scenario,
Yeah,
I guess the question is, how do we get there?
Well, I mean, the question is here. Look, if you're a European country and you're talking about following the path of America,
right.
part of the expectation should be demographic replacement migration. That is the American model, that we are going to replace your native population with elements of the third world and then remove the European aspect from your civilization as part of becoming modern. That has been the pattern in all European countries that have been under the American security umbrella.
Yeah, but those were decisions taken by their own local elites. Like, no, it wasn't General Eisenhower.
Their local elites only exist in those countries because America approves of them. If
100%,
America
but
disapproved of those
wait,
elites,
let
they
me
would
just
not
answer
be
that.
there.
Like the French made a decision, rightly or wrongly, on their own in order to import a lot of workers in the 30 glorious years, the 45 to 75, from their colonies to build stuff.
I
Like
flatly disagree
no
with you. That
American
was
told them to do
not an
that.
this mass replacement migration into Europe was not an organic decision that emerged from the populations of Western Europe. You can poll these populations again and again and again,
Sure, I mean,
and
like
you feel like you want to have mass replacement migration that will make you not your native demographic in 30 years. They'll be like, no, these opinions have been consistent for 70 years since
fine, but
Enoch Powell,
it
and
wasn't
they keep on
Americans who
happening.
made the
No,
elites do that,
it
man.
comes from their elites, and the only reason the elites are there is because the American government approves of them. That was the process after
I
World
agree with
War
the
II.
first and second thing you said, but not the third, man. Like, just obviously, I agree that populations are like they should replace themselves, and too much change inorganically too quickly destroys culture, and we all know that. And there's like a
Okay,
synthesis between cosmopolitanism and nationalism.
I'll
We
give
all
you an
agree on all
example
that
of this.
stuff, but
I'll
like,
give you an example of this. I'll give you an
please,
example of how I see this happening.
right,
Okay, so America, I don't think this is exactly true because there was a previous concept of America where America was sort of the Anglo stock that colonized this country initially. That was the founders' understanding of America. But
sure,
since the early 20th century, late 19th century, America was indeed a nation of immigrants to an extent. I am not Anglo stock. I am Eastern European / Irish stock, a little bit German. So American elites started saying, we're a nation of immigrants. We're a nation of immigrants. We need to integrate. We need to have diversity. So they had these phrases that you would never hear before in human history. We're a nation of immigrants. Diversity is our strength. We need to integrate. You never hear these phrases before the 20th century, and they only make sense in America. Those three phrases, they only make sense in the American context. You go to Europe in the 80s, and obviously none of the people say those, but guess who does say them? All of their elites. The elites in Europe had Black Lives Matter protests in jurisdictions that had barely any Black people. And for a context,
I saw.
Okay,
look,
but this indicates it's obvious where the European elites are getting this idea that they need to have mass migration, and they're getting it directly from America and American elites to the point where they're literally repeating the own propaganda slogans that only make sense in the United States and only make sense in the United States context.
Look,
so mass immigration.
But again, we didn't hoist those. It's not like there was a project at the elite American level to hoist those kinds of ideas on European elites. These things happened for reasons that they happened or should not have happened. But it's not like
I'm not entirely convinced of that. I'm not entirely convinced that. I'm not entirely. I mean,
Dave, can you bring us through
Department,
it? Can you bring us through the process, like starting from okay, we have these American elites, then how do these American elites influence the European elites? Like, let's break it down.
So I mean, these ideas emerge in the university. You know, they gain salience in America. And then the State Department general project is to make sure that the ideas that are popular in America are popular in Europe, so that there is an international ideological cohesion. They absolutely consider this their mission. Now, I don't think there's like a smoke-filled room where they're like, oh, yeah, we're going to replace, Europe with Somalians or whatever. But they see it as the fact that the more Europe is like America, the more cohesive it will be with America's plans to exert its sphere of influence across the world. And so first of all, the universities themselves, since they're all part of one common publication system, naturally the ideas flow to their universities. And then the State Department at a governmental level encourages people that have American-style ideas and decides to work with them over people who have more organic ideas like Enoch Powell. Enoch Powell's ideas were not radical. Enoch Powell's ideas were more or less the ideology that ruled Europe or ruled England for the previous 200 years.
Yeah.
The opinion of the State Department was that people like Enoch Powell were not cooperative. Why wouldn't you defend Enoch Powell?
I mean, he has a right to I'm not, because I'm not a racialist. Enoch Powell was a racist.
Enoch Powell. Why was he? Well, I don't know what racist even means.
Right.
Why is he condemnable in your? Why is what Enoch Powell? This is actually a good segue, right, Vlad? Why is what Enoch? Because you're exhibiting the very attitude that imposes the American attitude towards immigration onto Europe, where it's radically inappropriate. Now, I don't think there should be mass immigration in any country. I'm going to get that off the table right now. Not in America either.
Fine.
I think it's bad policy.
I'm against.
But explain to me why Enoch Powell is a condemnable figure.
Okay, well, so when you say rivers of blood, which is what he said,
it was a quote, and it also an accurate one. The amount of violence increase in England has been astronomical.
Sure.
They had like 4 stabbings in the last week. I mean, okay, when you're murdering children at a Taylor Swift concert, when you have stabbing after stabbing, is that not rivers of blood?
No, I think Vlad would agree with me that the cultural...
Maybe by an Eastern European standard.
Well, no. I think
I'll say that.
I think Vlad would agree with us here.
By the expectations of Western Europe, which is much less violent than Eastern Europe, the amount of increase of crime in the UK, it's like by 400%.
No, Dave, I want to make sure you don't turn.
It's enormous.
I want to make sure you don't turn Vlad into a straw man over here for the people who think certain things of that nature.
Okay,
because if we're talking about cultural incompatibility, I think it's very clear to anybody with half a brain that the people who come from these places like Afghanistan, that 90% of them, there's going to be a lot of problems as far as they just don't belong culturally speaking, as far as what they practice, as far as the lessons that their parents pass on to their children. Absolutely.
Sure.
So I think
assimilating those kinds of immigrants takes 4 generations or 5 as opposed to 1. Like Lev and I came to America 30 years ago and we're like perfectly well assimilated.
No, but even I would go a step further.
You're using the American example. This does not work in other countries. First of all, it doesn't quite work that way in America. There are huge, broad, unassimilated. First of all, I don't necessarily want cultural assimilation. That in many ways that's cultural homogenization.
Right.
But even so, like there are immigrant populations in the Philippines from China that have not assimilated for like 1,000 years almost.
Right.
There are immigrant populations in Africa that have not assimilated in 500 years. This idea that like you wait 6 generations and magically you assimilate, this is exactly what I am concerned about. This is where we're importing a very specific phenomenon that happened in a very specific time in America and assuming that it's some kind of law of nature.
And I want to go a step further. I would go a step further. I would say that if you are any Western country, you have to make sure that whoever it is that's going to be going into your country, it's not going to be this gambling thing. Well, maybe they'll assimilate, maybe they won't. There have to be things known in advance that 100% this person who's going to be a citizen of our country is already going to be at the level, however we define that level. That's my personal position. Okay. I think that's a pretty fair one, and that's a far cry from what's going on in Europe right now. I think you would agree with me there, Dave.
I will say that if you took a moderate from Enoch Powell's time, the person defense sitter in Enoch Powell's time, they heard the infamous Rivers of Blood speech, which again, Enoch Powell was quoting someone else saying Rivers of Blood, and he was accurate. But if you took them and you brought them from, 1970 to 2024 and showed them what's happening under the Keir Starmer regime, they'd be like, Enoch Powell was absolutely right. Everything he said was vindicated. This is just him accurately describing the future. That's what anybody from 1970s England would say if they could see 2024 right now.
Population shifts and population, you and I agree, population demographic shifts, which are too big and too fast, and with the wrong kind of people, with the wrong kinds of culture in too large numbers are extraordinarily disruptive to a population.
Which is exactly what Enoch Powell was saying in his speech.
Right, except like the racialism is very difficult for like a liberal. I mean, it's difficult for like American cosmopolitan liberal national like me to.
Race is just a reality. It is a reality. If you move populations that are of different races into the same area, there's an increase.
Culture is what I'm talking about.
Well, race is kind of
culture is correlated with race, and
I don't agree, man. I'm like.
I mean, we could say, for example, that race, in terms of the differentiation differentiations is culture times like thousands and thousands of years. People repeating
Right.
certain patterns over and over again and then starting to diverge in different ways. But more to the point about the universities, what I want to
Right.
get back to that. If we're talking about, let's say, the Sorbonne in Paris, attended, by Pol Pot and all of these
Right.
leftist intellectuals, that was an
Right.
American. That was like a leftism that was going on in Europe at the time. So I
100%,
see
man.
what you're saying, Dave, but I think that this is more of an international type of deal that, let's
Yeah,
say,
man.
has much.
Globalization went too far, but like the technology was there and planes were there, and it's very difficult to stem that kind of technological tide in a post-war situation.
Japan did it. Japan did it.
Yeah, they did it. Yeah, it's true.
This
Yeah, I
was
mean,
a decision the government made.
sure.
England decided to demographically transform itself. People like Enoch Powell warned them. Enoch Powell was right, and now they're suffering the consequences. And as a result, they're going to have a hard-handed government just to stop the country from dissolving into further chaos and violence.
But is it so much America's fault as opposed to this more international, stateless order, if you will, that's composed of
100%, yeah.
universities and people who inhabit them? Because that I see as making a lot more sense than just saying,
whatever you
like,
want to call it, internationalism.
Yeah,
Dave, we can call it
absolutely.
something different, but I don't think Americans are imposing that kind of thing. It's just
American.
like
What Americans are doing is they're feeding it money. This globalist elite that we
Yeah.
complain about in the universities is almost entirely being funded by United States taxpayer dollars.
yeah, because
They're being
America's the
funded by
winner.
paying the universities.
Because
they're being
America
funded
was
by
the
paying
winner.
State Department.
That's the
What?
problem, Dave. Like, I agree with you, but America happened to be the winner on the world stage. It was the fattest calf. So, of course, that was the one that a lot of these leftists, sank their teeth into and grew in this parasitic fashion. So, my only point here is that you are right that a lot of these universities and think tanks originate in America, but it's not
Right.
like they're American. It's that they're using the bountifulness of America and making that something that allows them to go into these other countries and make a lot of problems.
liberalism and
These
nationalism
ideas-
of a kind you're defending are not incompatible, man. Like they're not incompatible. Like in fact, they should be compatible.
Well, I mean, they should be compatible. They don't appear to be compatible in the 21st century. That's the problem right now, is that if you have just a huge demographic, first of all, liberalism only works in high trust societies, or only works well in high trust societies. And we have not been able, I don't think we've ever seen historically a high trust society that's been multicultural without the caveat here, without the existence of some kind of Lee Kuan Yew character to
Singapore.
keep everything under wraps, like Singapore.
No,
Yeah.
an ideology. Communism did it. The Austro-Hungarian Empire did it for a while. It didn't last more than a century.
Yeah, absolutely. Austro-Hungarian. That's my favorite example, right? Like, I would, as a person whose
Communism,
father
man. But
was born in,
communism, I was just teaching.
my grandmother.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Vlad, then Dave.
In fact, this is a good segue to actually what we're here to talk about. And I think what you and I will have a lot of common ground on, the rot of American elites, like the rot of the efficiency and capacity and competence of American elites.
Yes.
And why is it like my article was in a transition moment, but my article got to something very deep. American elites arming and helping and supporting two proxy states who are fighting our enemies could not turn them on a tactical or strategic moment on a dime in order to do or not do what they asked them to. I also happen to be a Zionist and a Ukrainian nationalist. And my mom survived October 7th. I want the IDF to beat Hamas. I want the Ukrainians to regime change Russia. And yet, as an American who's a member of the Atlantic Council, I'm looking, as a guy who writes for foreign policy in the Wall Street Journal, at the White House not being able to control our proxy client states in the middle of existential wars. Why is that? And why is that a failure of American elites that you and I can absolutely agree on?
Well, I mean, everything burns, doesn't it?
Uh,
I mean, you're saying
dies.
you're saying the rot. You're saying the rot of civilization and its consequences. It's almost, I guess, it's almost natural. I think it was brought about by certain decisions that America made with
Really?
how it's governed itself. Well, specifically in education.
Education, yeah, I agree. can I tell you? Can I just tell you a short? Like, can I tell you
Sure,
a story?
absolutely.
Like,
Yeah, yeah.
I do observe the younger. I'm close to 40 now. I'm not as young as I look or wish I was anymore. But I'm closer to 40 than 30 now,
Yeah, we're the
and
same
I'm no
age,
longer in my
Randall.
early 20s. But I do talk to younger colleagues in their early 20s, and I do take out 24 and 25-year-olds for lunch. And I was just amazed. I listened to these kids, and two-thirds of the young cadres that I observe in the State Department, in the think tank that I'm in Washington, D.C., in intelligence services, are just mediocre as hell. Like, they're just mediocre. They're just terrible. They're terribly educated. They don't have gumption. They don't have bravery. They're not smart. They're not like risk oriented. They're not like manly. I just don't like them unless they serve in the U.S. Army. Like they're just weenie elites. So I took the 24-year-old, a very bright Jewish kid, out for lunch yesterday, and this kid is actually at the level of the intelligence and bureaucracy as it should be. And he told me this amazing story. He started his master's degree in Georgetown yesterday. My 24-year-old friend, who's very educated and very bright and from a good family, and of the kind of ilk of young Americans that should be staffing up these structures, but are like 30, much worse than they were 25 years, 30 years ago, across the board in the quality of elites. And he tells me this amazing story. My 24-year-old pal, he starts his master's degree in Georgetown yesterday, and after the first day of class, he and six or seven classmates go out to a bar, and he makes a joke offhandedly. He says, "Okay, kids, let's go colonize the bar." And they all turn to him and they're like, "What? Colonize? That's bad. Colonization's bad."
Hmm.
Like, these kids were humorless and following a brain rotting script as if they were AI machines. That colonization was bad. All my young friends said was, "Let's go colonize the bar," and they all like looked at him. They're like, "You can't use that kind of language. Colonization is bad. Don't you know that? Don't you know that colonialism is the history of everything that's bad?" And so you listen to that kind of story from a 24-year-old who's going to be a mid-tier official in 10 years and a high-level official, hopefully, in 20 years. And you're thinking, these are the kids that are running America and they're going to run America? Something's really wrong here.
Well, I mean, this ideology. It's so funny because as a kind of a Californian, I feel like I got a preview of all coming attractions. Like, if you were in Berkeley in 1999 or the early 2000s,
Right.
and again, I'm not from Berkeley, but I visited people there a lot, and the you would see all of these ideas about anti-colonialism and anti-racism and anti-whiteness. They all were there back then. They were an extension. What you're seeing right now
Sure.
is the religion of the United States academic elite slowly becoming the religion of the ruling class all
Correct.
across the West, where
Correct.
America has its hegemonic control. This is a natural process because of the fact that the organic religions in these areas have been almost entirely undermined by American culture and by we
I
could debate
agreed
how
with
much of
everything
that's
you said
willful. Yeah.
except why. I agreed with your description, but not why it happened. I don't agree. I believe that something very terribly wrong happened in America that didn't quite go as badly wrong in France and Germany and the UK for structural reasons. I believe the elite structures of intelligentsia, of the media, especially publishing, collapsed 15, 12 years ago in America in a way that they did not in Western Europe as much. The American guardrails, the internal structures of the gatekeeping elites, all collapsed very quickly for reasons that you and I can differ on. But something really terribly wrong happened in America, especially with the media, with the aristocratic liberal gatekeeping class of publishing and the legacy media, which I'm part of.
Well,
It all went to crap. But
I
why?
should shut up here and let you talk because I feel like I talk about this all the time. What do you see? What's your theory about how this? Because I think oftentimes with liberals they see the problem happening much later than people like me.
Well, I mean, like I am like I was an academia and I saw this woke shit 20 years ago, but it was just like a subculture of academia,
Yeah, that's
and it
what you'd
didn't
assume,
matter.
right?
It was a subculture. When I was at CUNY 20 years ago, there were arguments about the canon and this, and there was a lot of wokeness and the pronoun stuff. And I just like, oh, this is the insanity of my New York bubble that doesn't
Yeah.
mean anything outside of outside of the sociology department at CUNY
That's
20 years
that's
ago.
that's exactly what I thought too. We're roughly the same age, and this is yeah. Your observations are identical to mine at
Right.
that time. Like, this is a cute little thing that only is going to exist in this nice little weird bubble that is Berkeley, California, and it will never go anywhere else. This is just how
And we
they
were
are.
wrong. But like
No, we were,
you're a
but
reactionary and I'm like a liberal cosmopolitan internationalist, but we agree fundamentally on like the terribleness of this.
no, but you should.
Yeah.
But I have come to the conclusion that you should naturally assume that whatever is popular among your academic class will become the religious beliefs of the next generation.
But like
It is
you use the word
incorrect to believe
religion.
anything else because it is a religion.
It is a religion, but it's like an ideology a la communism, which replaced religion. So what happened to the religion of America? Did it just stop being Christian? What happened?
Well, this is a specific Christian heresy that emerged in the.
Right.
I'm kind of cribbing Curtis Yarvin, but he's correct about this.
Right.
Progressivism is a religious heresy that emerged in the 20th century because of liberalism's inability to accommodate classic religions in a way that would allow both of them to thrive. And uh,
This obviously happened in communist countries, and but it wasn't supposed to happen in multicultural, multiliberal America. I mean, like it wasn't supposed to happen.
well, I mean, it's actually kind of interesting to see how it happened, how the Iron Curtain impacted this, right?
Right.
The Iron Curtain was created by a progressive ideology called a leftist ideology called communism, whatever word you want to use. It
Right.
emerged from the left in the 19th century,
Right.
and but what's weird about this is that it culturally slowed the poison that is wokeness. And that is because these bad ideas of wokeness and leftism are emerged from America and American academia. And the fact that
Really, America as opposed to like Europe, as opposed to
otherwise Russia would be more woke than in the United States, being a
right.
communist leftist country, but it's less, and that is because a particular brand of religion we're dealing with emerged from liberal America as a reaction to the flaws of liberalism. The flaws of liberalism made wokeism, I wouldn't say necessary, but they led logically to wokeism because essentially liberalism made certain promises that it could not fulfill. And wokeism was sort of the next step by which we could keep our liberal our the dream of a purely liberated man and still reconcile it with the issues that we're
Yeah,
seeing in the
needs of
20th
society.
century.
Mm. Look, that history of ideas is partially convincing and partially leaves a lot out, and it just and we're conflating progressivism and American classical liberalism with something in between that came out of academia in the 80s and 90s. I
Mhm.
So many of these debates people throw around liberalism, progressivism, social democracy. These are incompatible but different ideologies, obviously. uh just like uh just like the Soviet Union was actually socially very conservative. It was like
Mhm.
incredibly conservative. I mean, like couldn't get a divorce.
No,
I was just
well, at least
yeah,
initially, I believe the communists experimented with just complete social
libertinism.
libertinism, like
Libertinism for about 10 years,
in
yes.
the first few years of the
Yes.
revolution, but then they immediately backed off, right? Because they saw that it was unsustainable.
Yeah, well,
And
I mean, there was libertinism for about 12 years, and then Stalin and his cohorts made it conservative, and I just went like in
Mhm,
a very conservative direction.
exactly,
I mean, but again, it was like a kind of socially anarchic regime with all the fun stuff like parties and gang orgies and all that kind of stuff, and like drugs and homosexual decriminalization, all the fun stuff that is like the bread and butter of the kind of life that I enjoy living was the official ideology or official lifestyle and law of the communist regime for the first 10 years in the Soviet Union. But it quickly soured and it became very conservative to the point where my grandmother was not going to go get a divorce as a teacher because the principal of our high school would call her into the office and be like, "You're going to take away your party card if you go get divorced. Looks bad. What's going on?" Like the regimes became very conservative. So
We
it,
get
it
people saying based in the comments to that kind of conservatism, because I think like people are so dissatisfied with the
Yeah,
way things are very soft and sissy and whatever you want to call it
yeah.
today, that they almost like look at somebody like Joseph Stalin, regardless of the horrible things that he did, kind of like this, like, oh, this big man, very tough, like that's how desperate people are today, Vlad, when it comes to like
I
where we're living.
I know, man. Like, I mean, everything is out of whack and feels out of whack, and I get it. And a lot of his wokeness is like a reaction to very deep, you know, social issues, economic, political. Like, in some ways, wokeness is just the mind virus, whatever you want to call it, run wild because the elites mismanage the society. Like, if you don't have a job and hyperinflation is bad and you're losing wars and you're deindustrializing the country and the country's losing its sense of self and its like idea of American exceptionalism and the demographics are changing fast and the culture is becoming more and more stupid, you could like, you could bread and circus the people into going off into all sorts of stupid ideas like putting pronouns on their social media instead of working for, I don't know, economic equality, right? A
I
lot
have
of
a
this, go
I
ahead. A
mean,
lot of this,
yeah.
you've seen, Bud, you've seen them. I'm sure you've seen this meme, right? Where it's like, just this last year,
yeah,
Russia arrested over 100 people for posting memes. Isn't that a totalitarian, horrible system? They need regime change. And then the meme goes, oh shit, that's actually the United Kingdom. Forget about all that, right? You've seen that meme, right?
yeah. Like, look, the UK turns out not to have freedom of speech because of its weird contradictions between total freedom and a lack of a constitution and a lack of
But
and a,
that is,
yeah,
they're ahead of the curve. That is going
Yeah.
to happen in all
Well,
Western
and
countries.
and a lack of guns. I
and a
think
lack of guns. Yeah,
yeah, we have to
that's
keep that in
true.
mind too. The Second Amendment and all of that. Now you're in Canada, Dave, so I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah.
I
but
know, man.
I didn't exactly pick my countries
yeah,
based on their freedom
Are
of
you
speech
Canadian,
laws.
Dave?
My wife is.
yeah.
Okay,
So
okay.
he is
Yeah.
now.
So I
But
have my son's a dual citizen, so I end up divided between the countries a lot.
Okay.
pretty soon, like the upper half of Dave's face is gonna start separating from the lower half, and then yeah, for
But
those who
Dave,
like
don't
South
you
Park.
just like? I'm sorry to interrupt, Lev. Dave, don't
Yeah.
you just think all this culture war psychosis, and it is psychosis, is just downstream of radical mismanagement of the economy, radical mismanagement of people's capacity to rise in the world and make jobs and get a house. Like, isn't it just deindustrialization and the American dream being curdled? And people play acting on social media because they have nothing better to do. They can't
I,
change their
I
own life.
I mean, but I'm going to kind of punt here and say it's kind of a chicken and the egg thing. I
Yeah,
think I am not a materialist in this the way that Marx was. I do not believe that
right.
economics is. Oh, I think economics can drive, but it not. There are cultural features that are driving this, and one of the thing. The way we've managed our economy by financializing and essentially organizing the economy around printing money. This is a decision we made in well, we've been making it for 100 years, but the most recent of these decisions was in the 80s to essentially organize our economy around real estate bubbles.
Right.
And this was this essentially helped us patch over a lot of the problems that were generated by the 1960s. And it helped us avoid a lot of the questions that were made that seemed necessary that the 60s put in front of America.
Right.
And yet, that was the boomer experience. The boomers just punted on all of these culture war questions. But at some point when the money runs out, people have to decide, as Lenin famously said, whom. Who are we going to take from? And who are we going to
Кто
get?
кого? Who, whom?
Yeah, it makes much. I'm sure this makes much more sense in Russian. It does
Yeah.
not
It
translate
sounds better
well.
in Russian. Yeah.
No,
It sounds great
I'm
in
sure.
Russian.
I'm sure, but it does not
He
make
also
very much
said
sense
he
in
also said
English.
Tim hуже, Tim лучше, which translates as the worse the better, but it sounds so much better in Russian.
Hmm.
Yeah, whom is one of those things that people Americans are like, what does
Right.
that mean? But it just means like who's going to take like in its limited resources. It's a zero sum game. Someone is going to lose. Someone is going to win.
Mm.
And this is the problem is that these culture war questions will dictate who wins and who loses ultimately when the money starts running out. And so they're going to get more important as America gets poorer, not less important. As a matter of fact, the artificial bubble of wealth that we bought into in the late 20th century helped us put off the culture war questions that were brought up by the 60s. Until now, they're exploding in our faces. But I don't think you can definitely not answer them. Yeah.
If we had a more serious American political elite and Western political elite that was not cowardly, that was not weak, that was not coddled, that was not vulgar, that was not corrupt, that was not self-regarding, that was not decadent, whatever you want to call it, and they actually didn't mismanage the 90s and the peace dividend of winning the Cold War. They didn't deindustrialize the country. They didn't bring in too many robots and too many low-wage immigrants to lower the wages of American workers. If they didn't lose two wars, if they didn't financialize the economy, wouldn't we just have avoided all these culture war issues that we're talking about now?
No, but I think the thing is, I think it is overdetermined, actually, right? Because these decisions, it's not like they bought nothing. They're not just stupidity. They were short-term gains for long-term harm.
Sure.
And so what happened was that there was this. Americans started defining themselves more around consumption during the period in which they were on the right side of the immigration and money printing bubbles, which were essentially real estate bubbles ultimately. But now that Americans can't afford houses, there's not enough land to go around, and there's not enough jobs to go around. The cultural war decisions become more prominent. I don't know. I don't think that you could infinitely just sell people on consumption and economic growth without a nation actually deciding what was good and what was bad.
Right. You mean like a spiritual structure, or just like a basic social compact of what we are and how we live?
Well, I mean, I think that they're both interrelated. I think the social compact is based upon a set of spiritual beliefs that exist priorly, like Joseph de Maistre said, or I think almost everyone said that before the Enlightenment, right? Our founding fathers believed that too, right?
The Isaiah Berlin in me tittered when I heard a nice gentleman mentioned de Maistre.
The Fox and the Hedgehog is a masterful essay that I recommend everyone read.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, that is one of my favorite essays of all time. Although I don't agree with Berlin on everything, he was just a master, wasn't he? Sure, he was the last great Western intellectual, as far as I'm concerned, was Isaiah Berlin. People say Noam Chomsky, but I think Noam Chomsky stopped doing anything interesting after he finished publishing his linguistic papers.
Yeah, he became a Chomsky honk after that.
Yeah, I am not impressed by Chomsky's later contributions to politics. I think they're kind of
no one is. We don't. By the way, I've corresponded with Noam Chomsky.
He pwned William F. Buckley in a debate.
Wait, Vlad, repeat that again?
Yeah, go ahead.
I've corresponded with Noam Chomsky about Ukraine, and his arguments are just like second-year graduate student political science leftist. Like his it's amazing how smart one can be in one realm, and just how primitive one's thinking could be in another realm. There's nothing, I don't know.
He might agree with me, so I should maybe defend him.
Well, Dave, what does that tell you about your opinion on Ukraine when you've got a Chomsky honk agreeing with you about him?
Your arguments that he actually would not disagree with are on a much more sophisticated level than the ones Chomsky made to me in his private emails.
Let's as Shakespeare said, let's give a man a scepter of honor in his old age and not a sword to rule, as Titus said. And
he's had a stroke; he's no longer functional.
Yeah. Just we need to honor his, and I not necessarily agree with his linguistics either, but at least they were seminal, to say the least.
They were seminal, right?
Anyway, the thing is that we were talking about economics or something like that, right?
Culture.
If we go back
downstream of spiritual decadence and decay.
Yeah, of course. Yeah,
but I have a question there for Dave. So if we go back to the founding fathers, there was, even though America was founded by pilgrims, who were very, Protestant and had a lot of faith, a lot of the founding fathers generation were more of like the deist type. They were dabbling in the occult, I guess you could say, when it comes to, certain more paganistic ideas. And we could have like a back and forth argument about like how much of that initial Platonistic paganism was retained within Christianity to begin with.
Right.
But when it comes to to this culture where you do have the elites who may take a little bit more liberties, a little bit more libertine liberties, if you will, with how they conduct themselves in life, it may be important that the people that are, let's say, under them are under an umbrella of some unifying religion, which, you know, even if we have Gnostic informant, great friend of the show, coming on and saying, like, well, you know, this was taken from that and yada, 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 it really shouldn't matter. And maybe what is important, regardless of whether you believe it's a noble lie or not, is to have something that some people may consider to be a noble lie, but enable nonetheless for just like the organism to function. Do you know what I mean?
Well, I mean, in many ways, this is one of the ways that it, my great concern with Caesarism and the whole Curtis Yarvin perspective is that Caesarism is a noble lie. It's a noble lie to idolize this king because your religion is dead, essentially, which is what happened in Rome. And you get this nice little 300-year period where Rome continues to function, but is essentially spiritually hollow. And
America now.
Yeah, except without the functionality, right? That's the thing. It's not competently ruled. Yeah. So no one's leaving San Francisco, and no one discovered San Francisco in brick and left it in marble. I don't know. I mean, like with the founding fathers generation was a reaction to their Puritan grandfathers, right?
Right.
And when you read something like Poor Richard's Almanac, what you see is an attempt to secularize the ethics, the sort of Protestant work ethics that were naturally part of the religion. So what you have in America is like, this is what sort of progressivism is like, what we're going to try to, and of course there was the Great Awakening that revivified the Puritan spirit in America, both the first and the second Great Awakening. And what you have is sort of these spiritual elements of these religions reassert themselves in ways that are detached from the organic body and the organic whole. And I think that this, the problem with this is you get a lot of these ideas, and wokeness is part of this pattern. Wokeness is part of it's a Christian heresy that split off from Christianity in the early 20th century.
100%. I agree with this. I agree with this. And like the Great Awakening is a modern American Protestantism. As the American WASP class has lost power in the country, they've come back with a vengeance, with a new religion. I mean, this is American Protestantism, and I say this is as a Jewish outsider immigrant, and Lev also probably would say that. I don't disagree with anything you're saying, but like, what am I supposed to do with this in terms of constructing like national social cohesion? How am I supposed to live with you if that's what you believe? It's nonsense. It's insane.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to be like a pessimist here, but I think that the idea that we're going to have democratic national cohesion, and
oh, your microphone, Dave, we are not able to hear you.
Incorporate
your microphone's experiencing problems right now, Dave. Dave, hold on.
I say this: the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it needs to be organized so that people can have their own little communities that are separatist. And that the government rules the mainstay of the country, the multicultural areas of the country, which will almost certainly be the economically generative parts of this country, or most of them, I guess, and then manages them in a way that will not be destructive to the former. I think that's and I think I'm a critic of Israel, but I think that they have kind of a system like that where they have these weird religious separatists that keep the demographics of the country going on, and then the government kind of keeps Tel Aviv kind of apart from that, and I think I don't like that system entirely, but that seems to be what this age requires, because we do not have a common religion upon which you could base like this high trust cohesive society the way you saw it in the 19th century. I don't know what the basis for that would be.
We don't. You could replace a.
I can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
I'm able to hear you. Dave, are you coming
Dave, can you
through?
hear me?
There's a problem with Dave's headphones. We experienced that a few seconds before. While Dave is trying to figure out his headphone situation, if you guys are enjoying the show, make sure to smash that subscribe button right now. I see a lot of the people watching. I'm not sure if you guys are subscribed, so smash that button like you mean it, and if you smash it, then Dave's headphones are going to start working again, and so
We
will
should
his mic.
smash,
Yes,
smash.
smash. And patreon.com/break the rules. Listen, if you want to support these kind of conversations, where else are you going to have a senior fellow of the Atlantic Council, meeting a reactionary intellectual? This is the place, pretty much the only place where this happens. So,
We agree on quite a lot. Dave and I actually don't disagree on a lot of stuff. Actually, I have to tell you.
Oh, that's good.
Um,
I think the reason
Dave,
why I'm brought on is because I had a very spicy fight with a blogger about 8 months ago that everyone keeps on talking about. But anyway, yeah, let's. Yeah. Anyway,
Dave, I just want one last question to you. The religion, we agree that America is probably going to be post-Protestant and even post-Christian. Certainly, the people who rule America do not have the same values or ideas or religiosity as the people that they rule. It's just a fact. The ruling class of this country no longer looks like the people that they are supposed to represent, and that's never a good thing, right? That's just not good. A social elite should be representative of their constituency. But can we replace a religiosity, especially in a country which is quickly changing demographically, with a thick, as they say in political science, sociology, a thick culture that just doesn't take the spiritual questions and big ideas into account, and just a big culture, whatever that is, a thick culture that we all agree on. Is that a sustainable?
so wokeism. So if we had gone in the pattern of previous eras of America, wokeism would be the new religion of America. Essentially, I mean, it wouldn't be official, but everyone would wokeify. So this happened in the early 20th century, right, where you got kind of this progressive perspective on internationalism and liberalism, and then you had the Catholic Church, and I'm not of this community, but I assume the Jewish community as well. What they did is they took their religions and they kind of made it liberal and Americanized, right? They
Right.
Americanized and liberalized their religions.
Right.
If the thing is the new version of that is woke, but it's insane and incompetent. It doesn't work, and
Right.
so
And destructive.
it's absolutely.
It would be
Well, it's
okay if it
always
didn't
destructive.
work, but it's just also destructive to an empire.
It destroys it and doesn't replace it with anything that works. And so what you
Right.
have here is everyone's like, okay, this iteration doesn't work. The problem here is that wokeism has taken over our ruling class and
Right.
our artistic class. So the big problem right now that we're dealing with in America is essentially the fact that our ruling class has diametrically opposed beliefs to most healthy human beliefs.
Correct.
You can see this in transgenderism most clearly, especially around youth transgenderism,
Sure.
where you'll have the ruling class saying like it's a human rights violation not to allow your child to transition, whereas all other religions are like it's a human rights violation to allow your child to transition.
Sure.
That's irreconcilable. And I compare it to that case in early 20th century England where there was a Jewish child that was converted because they were on their deathbed to Christianity, and they had a huge crisis of the public religion because they weren't able to reconcile that. The sort of the apostasy laws and the freedom of religion of the Jewish family. But that is gonna happen everywhere in America because of the fact that the reigning religion of our elites is fundamentally incompatible with human nature. If you could just veto democracy, the optimal way to run the country would just be to let everyone manage their own communities and live separately. But the problem is, I don't see how that kind of competition can be made in the
Ottoman Empire millet system. The Ottoman Empire did that.
Ottoman Empire did that. Austrian-Hungarian Empire did that.
Yeah.
Russia did that. It was essentially what Russia did before the communists.
Empire.
Yeah.
Right.
So I mean, like that is in my mind that is the optimal move. But the problem is that inside an electoral democracy, the game theory incentive is always to be the culture war and double down on the insanity. And Kamala Harris is trying to put the woke away. and she's
Right.
still insane. She's still
Right.
insane.
Well, that's the question of like if you stare into the abyss too long. Like I'm sure there were a lot of people who were very, tongue in cheek about their appreciation of George Floyd and whatnot. But at the same time, if you're part of that blob, then you can't help but start
Right.
aping certain ways people act, and all of a sudden you find
Right.
yourself playing this caricature. So that brings me to the final question that I wanted to ask you guys. We were talking before this started about the founding fathers, not even as far as like their beliefs, but more of like how were they educated? Like were they actually, most of them, not even saying the founding fathers, but like that whole generation, were they wiser than a lot of the elites that we have today, just as far as, they studied Cicero and Latin and all
Oh my
that good
God,
stuff.
yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, but I don't know because I don't
Yeah.
live there. I can't just have this rose-colored glasses look at the past and say like, oh, they were so smart and wise. Maybe they were, but how do we know? Like, what are the things, Dave, that you would say we can take a look at to really, to really paint the picture of how different those people were compared to us? And is there any way of bringing something of that sort back?
Well, I mean, there were obviously the founding fathers were educated by the initial generation of the Ivy League schools as we know them today, the Princetons and the Harvards and stuff like that. That they were originally seminaries designed to educate men like this. And what the founding fathers had was a combination of their old Puritan or Calvinist beliefs or Quaker beliefs and the new fashionable stuff that was coming out of Europe that was much more secular. And I don't know. I mean, you just look at anybody's family, and if you come from a family like mine that has until recently had members of it that were born in the old European world. The old European world generated people of such stature and nobility that it's very, very hard to imagine them existing in a world where Kamala Harris is the best the Democratic Party has to offer. I don't. The only way I can see of recovering that is to essentially create alternative academies where people experiment with radically different modes of educating, in particular, young men, and to a much lesser extent, young women, or I should say, in exceptional cases, young women. If we could radically experiment with different ways of doing that, then maybe we could capture some of the old fire that the American elites had that made the country and that conquered the world. And I hold their conquest of the world, or at least half of it, to their credit, because hail to the victors, right?
Well, just to quickly follow up on that before Vlad responds.
Can I
Sure.
say hail to the victors in Canada?
No.
Before
Isn't that a soccer thing? I don't know.
yeah.
Before
So before Vlad
too much glory and piss
Yeah.
and vinegar and fighting. I mean, that kind of passion makes them uncomfortable.
Yeah, of
indeed.
course.
Yeah. Well, isn't that a quote from Trudeau? If you kill your enemies, they win. But anyway, if we go back though, as far as how do we know? And again, I'm not saying that what you're saying is wrong, Dave, but for those who are extremely skeptical, how do we know that a lot of these people in the old days were this wise? And it isn't just like, well, the history was written by the victors, so of course they'd, show themselves as being wiser than they were.
Well, like I said before, like I can see the generation that came before mine, and they were wiser. So I have N=1 sample of degeneration that I've observed physically with my own eyes. And then I kind of look at the output that these, take for instance, Thomas Jefferson, which is a person who I disagree with on a lot of things, but he was just this great man, like or Benjamin Franklin. The breadth of his accomplishments is impossible to imagine. Now, part of that is because there was a lot of low-hanging fruit.
Yeah.
He was, you could literally go out in your backyard and discover a fundamental force of physics, because physics was so underdeveloped
now, man. Well,
yeah,
it's really difficult to get good at anything now.
In between running a newspaper and designing a country, you invented a whole area of physics.
Yeah, and now we've got AI.
Part of that is low-hanging fruit,
right.
but also part of that is just the fact that human beings thrive on hardship, and human beings, in my opinion, are given greatness by incredibly strong religion and hardship. And the founding fathers generation had been formed by the insane religion that was Puritanism. And I'm not a Puritan, but I admire the insanity of that religion. And
Me
they
too.
were formed by the religious ferocity that was Puritanism, and the ferocity that was the American frontier. And I think
Mm.
in the South, you were more formed by the frontier, which was a little bit more wild in the South. And in the North, you were formed by the harshness of nature and your strong religious upbringing.
I would add one more thing into the equation, though, which I think bears mentioning. There was this gentleman, and I'm not attributing, the entire Renaissance to him, but I think he played a really big role in it, named Gemistus Plethon. He was this philosopher in the Byzantine Empire who lived at around the time right before the Muslims took over Constantinople. That was like the year that he died. So he was like around that time where you had these monks at Mount Athos who were, talking about how, well, we don't really have a problem if the Muslims invade so long as they keep our Mount Athos, whole and leave us alone. So they weren't really that concerned about the politics at the time, and they did not like Plato, and they kept all of, Plato's archives, you could say, all his writings in like this really horrible condition. But eventually that managed to get its way into some of these intellectuals at the time within the Byzantine Empire, like Plethon, who was not, from what I read, he was not a Christian. He was a Platonist heathen, you could say. He was he believed in Zeus as being like the top guy, but not like the top guy who, did all these horrible things. More of like this principle, this Platonic principle, out of which like you had this emanation of forms into, the physical form that we're in right now. But to make a long story short, Plethon met with Cosimo de' Medici and convinced him to open the Platonic Academy in Florence, where you had a lot of these Renaissance intellectuals. And I believe it is from there that a lot of this, resonation with ancient Rome and all of these republican principles, as well as some of this paganism, but in this much more philosophical way, was transferred to people like the founding fathers. So it wasn't, I think, just a matter of them being like, I'm going to be naughty, I'm going to go away from my, Puritan ancestors. I think it was still something that was like kept, secure, at least, since that time of the Renaissance, and managed to bring about, you have these statues like, George Washington as like this Greek Olympian god in Washington, D.C. and all of that.
Yeah.
So I think that is a very important part of this whole story when we're talking about this, this philosophical history that managed to be passed on. And I think that is a big motivator as well of what enabled a lot of these giants that were standing on the shoulders of to do what they did. I don't know, Dave, I'm curious, any thoughts on that? And then we're going to go to Super Chats.
No, I mean, we all.
Gents, I have to
Yeah.
get going in about 5-10 minutes, but I just
Okay.
very briefly before Dave answers that. Sorry, I just want to say one thing. I just think we should have more immigrants taking power. I just think we should bring like maybe Americans just screwed up and just bring an entire generation of rising young like weirdo crazy elites from other places formed by Central Asia and post-communism and just like wars and just give them American power. Just give up half the government posts to weirdo intellectual immigrants such as myself.
I think Trudeau might have your back on that one, but it's all coming from. I think it's all coming from South Asia.
Yeah, well, but Dave, go ahead. Yes.
All right, so I mean, we all stand on the shoulders of giants, right?
And soldiers of giants as well, if we're talking about like military. Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
the problem is that this process of history, and I'm growing to understand the cyclical nature of history more and more. And the problem is that like as you do this, it builds complexity in the system that can only that this. And so what you have is all of these systems that are being run by people that don't understand what they're for, what they're trying to do, or even how to necessarily run them. And at this stage, I don't even know what the West is really doing. In Britain, it seems like it's the most obvious, although I haven't been there in a while, or I've been there only briefly in a while. And it feels like the government just has all of these systems that they've inherited either from the late 20th century Blairite government or the old England, and they just have no idea what to do with them. They have no idea how to manage them. And there's like, I guess I'll press this button and see what happens. Is this the button that's going to allow my government to last in power for another 4 years and let me hire more of my friends? Okay, I'll press that one. And so the government just becomes this self-serving entity, and eventually it just rots away. I don't know what's the alternative to that.
I don't have a good answer for you either, man. All I know is that like you and I have a different vision of what America's like role in the world should be, but we have a completely the same vision of what the problems are internally with American elites and their culture and their psychology, and how badly they're formed by institutions, and how badly they run institutions, how badly they're destroying what was bequeathed to them, and how stupid they are, and like the corruption of the American idea and institutions and economic basis, right? We agree on that. And I don't have any answers to this either. Maybe these are just like deep historical trends that we just need to live through, and maybe America will go the way of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I hope not. But, like I was born in one evil empire, and I moved to Russia, and then like I became an enemy of the state, and then I lived in America, and now it's got problems, and then I lived in Europe, and now it has problems that just maybe I'll go somewhere else.
Oh man, talk about okay, so we have some super chats. We have some super chats over here. Vlad, I know you have to go really soon.
Yeah.
Could you stick around just a bit? Super chats, and it's all from the same person. It's all from the same person named Glow in the Dark. So $5 over here. A thick culture is just like sweeping trash under a rug, which will most likely make it worse. You have to address the mess before it gets bigger. Let me read all of this, by the way, just so it's all another $5. One of the major problems with changing directions is the number of people who are benefiting from the original direction, so hard to shift gears. And number 3 over here, $10. From Glow in the Dark, once again, the MVP. Compared to many today, founding fathers were smart, but compared to some of the people from the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, not so much, or Archimedes for that matter. And the last super chat over here from Glow in the Dark, $5. No one dedicated themselves to anything anymore, so lacking in ability is to be expected when people used to start at 7 to dedicate to a profession. Well, no one's dedicated themselves to anything anymore, or no one is dedicating themselves. I hate to be a grammar Nazi, but anyway.
Grammar Nazi. I'll say one thing, and then I'm gonna say goodbye to Dave, and I have to catch the Amtrak. And I'll see you soon in New York, Lev. But
that's right.
The gentleman, my response to that is one, Dave and I agree on the need for educating and forming a new political elite. I too want regime change, peaceful regime change within the quality of the imperialist cadres within the think tank. I want better imperialism. I want better American elites to have. I mean, I'm joking, but I'm not actually joking. In Russian, we say there's a доля шутки в любой шутке. There's a element of a joke in every joke, right? There's a like the whatever ends of American policy are, you need better American elites, competent elites, young people to advance that policy. And where we are now is just really crappy. And maybe it's technology, maybe it's the metaphysics, maybe it's just the age, maybe it's like the Napoleonic vibe shift, Hegelian blah 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 thing where things are just mediocre because they have been mediocre. Maybe real culture somewhere else. Maybe like all the greats right now are in India somewhere, or in Southeast China, or somewhere I don't have access to. And yet there are remarkable personalities in every age. In a population of 350 million people, there will be a lot of smart people. Some of them will be competent at various things. Some will be good at art. Some will be good at running things. How do we put those people in the right management positions to run things is obviously a technical question. But yeah, we're talking about a very deep crisis of the age and a crisis of meaning and a crisis of being able to articulate how we want to run the country and how we want to live together and not be mediocre. And I don't have very good glib answers to that. Dave?
Uh, I think the question of competent technical management is, I think, a mirage. What we were dealing with is fundamentally a religious crisis and a crisis of belief. You cannot make management decisions without a component of value and without value judgments. And the problem is that our society has radically lost hold of what its primary values are, foundationally speaking. And you can see this most prominently in how some people don't care that families are falling apart, which was a primary value in most classic civilizations. So I agree that in the sense that Curtis Yarvin's idea of a king is a managerial solution to this problem. It fundamentally will not work because kings cannot well, I guess if you're a messianic king, you can institute a religion. But for the most part, the Caesarian king that he imagines, or Yarvin imagines, is not going to solve the fundamental religious crisis at the core, which I think has to be addressed through education, separation, and time. We can come up with managerial solutions, but they're all going to be band-aids until there's a revivification of a religion that it can actually hold sway in the West and not be insane. Like,
can it not be in a religion? Can it just be like a spiritual thing that we all agree on in the West? Can we
I don't think so.
Christianity back.
I even disagree there, because for the most part, I think it was the elites who managed to be a lot more flexible when it comes to what exactly is out there. But I think a lot of people just need, this is the answer, this is the way. And then, and then hopefully, when they pass away, they will be in that realm that they imagine themselves to be in because of the way our universe works. But that's like a whole other discussion, which one day I'd love to have.
I gotta go. Dave, absolutely lovely. Thank you so much. You're a gentleman and a scholar.
Great talking to you, Vlad. Thanks so much.
Lev, thank you for bringing us together. Goodbye, everybody. Smash that button. See you guys soon, and we'll all be together in a better place soon.
Sounds good, buddy. Take care, Vlad.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Yeah, so there we have it, guys. This is what Break the Rules does. I mean, Dave, I've been watching you. I remember back in, 2018, 19? I was sitting on the New York subway, listening to your podcast talk about creating all of these alternative societies, if you will, like where you would have like this person doing this person doing that, like certain leaders, if you will, people who bring other people together. And I was listening to that, I was thinking like, I may not agree with a lot of the potentialities of what having, this regime run by a king as, the last measure, what exactly that would, that would entail. But at the same time, I knew from the very beginning how important it was not to have what you're talking about only among the people who are kind of like part of the choir already. So my whole project here with BTR has been to bring you together with people like Vlad, who understand the things that you're talking about, as opposed to it only being like the snake eating its own tail. Because you never know. I think there are new things that could be learned. I'm learning, and I think you're humble enough to say as well that there are new things that you end up finding out. And I'm not saying that it would be like right now, specifically with this conversation, but in general, that I think is like the most important thing that we can do right now is to be much more flexible in our thinking in order to make whatever decision ends up being made be as correct as it possibly can be, given the circumstances. So
it was a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Anytime. I love having you over, Dave. And what do you got to plug? What's next on the Distributist YouTube channel? Writing any books? Anything?
I'm going to try to get back to writing more. That's my main object. I obviously have a bunch of live streams. I'm going to try to make those more frequent because people like them a lot. But it's the YouTube channel and the Substack that's Letters from Fiddler's Green. And you can follow me on either of those places.
Excellent. And final from Glow in the Dark, $5. People of the past were stupid too. Don't kid yourselves. We just have middle of the road types, which isn't so bad compared to some Roman emperors. Yeah, so that is like another thing to think about as well, because you did have like a lot of wise people, but then also a lot of, I wouldn't say dumb. Like, I don't like the idea that people say like, oh, these peasants were dumb. They were probably 100 million times better at knowing their environment, and, what to plant, and having certain senses of, when it's going to rain and when the weather's going to change. But that, I think, is just a product of you having to survive in an environment. You end up becoming very wise to very specific things, tuned to very specific things. So by no means am I saying, like, oh, these people were dumb or anything like that. But in our age today, there are going to be certain things that I think we're going to have to pick up on and deal with AI and so on and so forth, but I look forward to having future conversations like that. And one final thing, I had a dream last night that Elon Musk was on the Break the Rules stream, but he was wearing this Russian crown, which was a little bit foreboding. I don't know what to think about that. That doesn't sound that good.
He is Curtis Yarvin's Caesarian figure made manifest,
Yeah, but I think a lot of those people
are the Tsar of America.
Yeah, but I think they're very naive when it comes to Russia. But that's like a whole other discussion. Like, I wish, like, even Joe Rogan, he has certain people around him that tell him, good things about Vladimir Putin, and he just, anyway, that's a whole other discussion. But anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. Dave, it's always a pleasure to have you on, man. I look forward to more streams, Break the Rules, bringing all the people together. Patreon.com/breaktherules. Become a patron today. And we're going to have an event with Jason Reziger Johnny coming up very soon, hopefully around mid-September, with a roof party in Manhattan at my condo/BTR studios. So if you guys want to see the recording being done and then hang out, become a $20 patron, and you're going to support the show as well as having access to these events. And as well as other wonderful things on the BTR Patreon, exclusive episodes, including one that I did recently with Raheem Kassam, also at the New York studio as well. And other great things. You guys get to be a part of growing this thing that brings people together. Thank you guys so much. Thank you, Dave. Until next time.